Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever walked through a crowded room, your shoulders hunched and your eyes down, feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives? We build walls around ourselves, and we build them around others, labeling them by their jobs, their clothes, their station. We see a uniform, not a soul. We see a task, not a talent. But what if we are wrong? What if inside the quietest, most overlooked person you know, there is a fire waiting for a single gust of wind to become an inferno? This is a story about a woman the world had forgotten, and the day it was forced to remember her name. Her name was Alara, and she was a cleaner. Every night, she moved through the glass and steel cathedral of sterling innovations, a silent custodian of forgotten coffee cups and overflowing waste bins. To the ambitious programmers and stressed executives who sometimes worked late, she was just a shadow in a gray jumpsuit, the rhythmic squeak of her cart a part of the building's ambient noise. They never saw her face, hidden beneath the deep hood of her worn sweatshirt. They never knew her story. They couldn't possibly imagine the universe of numbers and patterns that spun ceaselessly behind her quiet, watchful eyes. Alara didn't just clean, she brought order to chaos. It was a compulsion, a silent language she spoke with the world. In the marketing department, she would arrange discarded flyers into geometric patterns before sweeping them away. In the break room, she would subconsciously line up the salt and pepper shakers in prime number sequences. And in the office of the CEO, Arthur Sterling, she performed her most intricate, unseen work. His office was a storm of frantic energy, whiteboards scrawled with fractured equations, desks littered with financial reports, and a corkboard overflowing with sticky notes arranged in no discernible order. But to Alara, it was a symphony out of tune. While wiping down the surfaces, her hands would move with a gentle, corrective grace. She would nudge a sticky note with a critical data point next to another that held its corresponding variable. She would shift a stack of market analyses so they were in chronological order. She didn't read them, not in the conscious sense. She felt their weight, their relationships, the logical connections that screamed out to her from the chaos. It was a small, secret act of defiance against the disorder of her own life, a life that had once been so full of promise before it had been shattered into a million pieces. She was a ghost in the machine, a silent curator of brilliance she believed she could never touch. Tonight, however, the silence in the building felt different. It was heavy, suffocating, laced with the metallic tang of fear. Alara could feel it humming through the polished concrete floors, a vibration of despair that had seeped into the very bones of Sterling Innovations. The company was dying. A rival had just launched a devastatingly superior product, gutting their market share overnight. Their stock was in freefall. At the heart of the crisis was Helios, their flagship data analytics algorithm, the engine that powered their entire enterprise. And Helios was broken. A deep, critical flaw had emerged, a cascading error that no one could pinpoint, let alone fix. They were bleeding data, clients, and money, and the wound was getting wider every hour. Inside the main boardroom, the air was thick with blame. Arthur Sterling, a man whose face was usually a mask of calm, patrician authority, looked haggard. His eyes, sunken and shadowed, scanned the faces of his top executives. They were the best minds money could buy, a collection of PhDs and programming prodigies from the world's most prestigious universities. And they were all failing him. Marcus Vance, the head of operations, stood rigid, his jaw tight with a mixture of panic and resentment. He was a man who believed in pedigree, in the clear, unassailable logic of resumes and qualifications. "It's the engineering team, Arthur," he declared, his voice cutting through the tension. They got complacent. Too many beanbags and free lunches, not enough results. We need to send a message. We need to start cutting the dead weight. The lead engineer, a young genius named Ben, looked up, his face pale. "It's not that simple, Marcus. The logic is sound. We've run every diagnostic a dozen times. It's like there's a ghost in the code, something we can't see." Marcus scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "A ghost? We're a multi-billion-dollar company, and our excuse is a ghost. This is what I'm talking about. We need discipline, not poetry." this was the grenade that had been thrown into the heart of their world. It was live, ticking, and no one knew how to defuse it. While they argued, Alara was on the same floor, pushing her cart down the silent, empty corridor. She passed the boardroom, its glass walls frosted for privacy, but she could feel the frantic, discordant energy pulsing from within. She kept her head down, her world shrinking to the scuff mark on the floor she needed to erase, the smudge on the glass she needed to wipe away. Her job was to make things clean, to erase the messy evidence of human effort. It was a role she had accepted long ago. She was the person who came after the story was over, to reset the stage for the next day. She had no idea that tonight, she wasn't there to clean up the end of a story. She was about to become its beginning. Late that night, long after the shouting in the boardroom had subsided into a grim, exhausted silence, Arthur Sterling sat alone in his office. The city lights glittered beyond his panoramic window, a galaxy of success stories that suddenly felt a million miles away. His own story felt like it was ending. On the vast whiteboard that covered an entire wall was the source of his agony, the core architecture of the Helios algorithm. It was a dizzying web of symbols, loops, and conditional statements, a map of a digital mind that was having a nervous breakdown. He and his team had been staring at it for weeks, attacking it from every conceivable angle, and getting nowhere. They were too close, too invested, their thinking trapped in the very paradigms that had created the problem. He stood up, his joints aching with fatigue, and rubbed his temples. He needed coffee, anything to cut through the fog of defeat. He walked out of his office, leaving the door slightly ajar, and headed towards the deserted break room, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. That was when Alara arrived. She pushed her cart into the CEO's office, her presence as unobtrusive as a change in air pressure. The room was a mess as usual, but the energy was different. The scribbles on the whiteboard felt alive, buzzing with a desperate, chaotic energy. She began her routine, emptying the trash, wiping the desk, her movements practiced and efficient. But her eyes were drawn to the board. They always were. Tonight, it wasn't just a puzzle. It was a cry for help. She saw the elegant flow of the initial design, the beauty in its logic. But she also saw the blockage, the place where the harmony broke down. Her mind, unburdened by programming syntax or corporate pressure, saw only the pure, underlying pattern. It was like looking at a beautiful tapestry with a single, jarringly misplaced thread. The so-called experts saw a million possible knots, a million complex failures. Alara saw only the thread. Hesitantly, she moved closer. The board was covered in the frantic markings of a dozen different people, a battlefield of failed ideas. But in one corner, there was a small, isolated cluster of equations that seemed to be the source of the cascading error. Everyone had focused on the big, complex parts of the algorithm, but the flaw, she sensed, was not in the engine itself, but in a tiny, overlooked gasket. It was a recursive loop that was failing to terminate, endlessly feeding on itself and corrupting the data downstream. It was a simple, almost stupid mistake, hidden in plain sight. Her hand trembled as she reached for a red dry erase marker lying in the tray. She shouldn't. This was not her world. To touch this board was a transgression, a violation of the invisible barrier that separated her existence from theirs. But the wrongness of the pattern was a physical ache in her mind. She couldn't leave it. With a featherlight touch, she didn't write an equation or offer a solution. She simply circled the tiny, flawed loop. Then, she drew a single, clean arrow, pointing from that circle to a separate, stable subroutine on the other side of the board, a part of the system no one had thought to connect it to. It was a suggestion, a whisper of logic. Just then, she heard the soft thud of footsteps returning down the hall. Panic seized her. She dropped the marker back into the tray, her heart hammering against her ribs. Using the sleeve of her jumpsuit, she frantically wiped her fingerprints from the smooth plastic barrel of the marker and slipped out of the office, melting back into the shadows of the corridor just as Arthur Sterling walked back in, a steaming mug in his hand. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and his eyes drifted back to the whiteboard, the landscape of his failure. He was about to turn away when he saw it. A small, perfect red circle and a crisp red arrow. They were not his. They were not made by anyone on his team. His handwriting was a frantic scrawl, his engineers used precise, technical notations. This was something else. It was calm. Confident. Simple. Fury flared in him first. Who had dared? Who had the audacity to graffiti his crisis, to add their meaningless doodle to his multi-billion-dollar catastrophe? He strode to the board, ready to wipe away the impertinent marks. But then he stopped. He looked at what was circled. He followed the arrow. And the breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a doodle. It was an insight. An impossible, brilliant, maddeningly simple insight. The flawed loop they had been trying to fix head-on, the arrow suggested they shouldn't fix it at all. It suggested they should bypass it entirely, rerouting its function to a stable, underutilized subroutine that had the processing capacity to handle the load without creating a feedback loop. It was an idea so elegant and so far outside their exhausted groupthink that no one had even come close to considering it. It wasn't the whole solution, but it was a key. It was the key. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him, chasing away the fatigue. Who? Who did this? His mind raced through his team. Ben? No, he was a genius, but his thinking was linear. Sarah? Too cautious. He stormed out of his office and marched straight to the security desk in the main lobby. I need the camera footage from the 44th floor, corridor C, outside my office. For the last 10 minutes. Now the night guard, startled, fumbled with the controls. The footage appeared on the monitor. Sterling watched, his eyes narrowed, as he saw himself walk out of his office. A few moments later, a figure in a gray jumpsuit pushed a cleaning cart into view. The figure entered his office. A minute passed. Then, the figure scurried out, pulling their hood down even lower, and disappeared down the hall. Sterling stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The cleaner. The janitor. The invisible person. A wave of disbelief washed over him, followed by a surge of something else, profound, electrifying curiosity. The next morning, Arthur Sterling walked into the office with a purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. The key was in his mind, the elegant red circle and arrow burned into his memory. He knew it was the path forward, but he also knew he needed the mind that had drawn it. He called Marcus Vance into his office. I need you to find one of the night cleaners for me, Sterling said, his voice clipped and direct. Marcus, ever the gatekeeper of corporate hierarchy, raised a skeptical eyebrow. A cleaner, Arthur? Is there a problem with the service? I can call the contracting company and have them replaced immediately. The casualness of the word, replaced, grated on Sterling. No, Marcus. I don't want them replaced. I want to talk to one of them. The one who cleaned my office last night. Marcus Vance's face settled into a mask of polite condescension. He saw the world as a pyramid, and he was comfortably in the upper tiers. Cleaners were the foundation, necessary but unseen and interchangeable. With all due respect, Arthur, we have a company to save. I have the severance packages for the Helios team ready for your signature. We should be focusing on damage control, not chasing down the janitorial staff. They're anonymous, contracted out. It would take days to track down a specific individual, then take the days, Marcus, Sterling snapped, his patience wearing thin. I don't care what it takes. Check the security logs, call the contractor. I want that person in my office by noon. Marcus stared at him, bewildered. May I ask why? Did they steal something? Sterling leaned forward, his eyes intense. No. They left something. An idea. Now find them. The command was absolute. Marcus, though seething with frustration at the absurd task, had no choice but to comply. He saw it as a sign that Sterling was cracking under the pressure, his judgment clouded by stress. Wasting precious time on a cleaner while the company burned felt like madness. He delegated the task with a dismissive wave of his hand to his assistant, convinced it was a fool's errand. For the next few hours, a bureaucratic search began. Phone calls were made. Spreadsheets were consulted. To the contracting company, Alara was just a number, an employee ID. To find her, to pull her out of the vast, anonymous pool of night workers, was like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach. But Sterling was relentless. He called Marcus every 30 minutes for an update, his insistence growing more urgent. Finally, just before noon, Marcus's assistant got a name, Alara. And a location. She was on site, working a rare day shift to cover for a sick colleague, currently cleaning the server farm on the 23rd floor. Marcus himself, with a sense of theatrical annoyance, went to retrieve her, wanting to witness the culmination of this bizarre distraction firsthand. Alara was wiping down the humming server racks when he found her. The air in the room was cold, filled with the whir of fans. Alara, Marcus said, his tone making her name sound like an accusation. She flinched, turning around slowly. Her hood was down, and for the first time, one of the company's executives saw her face. She looked young, younger than he'd expected, with eyes that held a deep, weary intelligence. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you." Now fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This was it. Someone must have seen her on the cameras. She was going to be fired for touching the whiteboard. She would lose the one thing that gave her life a sliver of stability. Her hands, damp with cleaning solution, felt numb. She followed Marcus in silence, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He led her to the 44th floor, to the CEO's office. The door was open. Arthur Sterling was standing by the window, but he turned as she entered. His expression was not angry. It was something else, something she couldn't read. Intense. Curious. "Leave us, Marcus," Sterling said without taking his eyes off Alara. Marcus hesitated, wanting to stay, but the dismissal was final. He closed the door, leaving the CEO and the janitor alone in the silent, sunlit office. Alara stood just inside the doorway, clutching a cleaning rag in her hand as if it were a shield. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the axe to fall. "The whiteboard," Sterling began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Last night. Did you draw on it?" She flinched, a barely perceptible movement. She couldn't bring herself to speak, only managing a small, terrified nod. She braced herself for the inevitable lecture, the termination, the walk of shame out of the building. Instead, Sterling walked over to his desk and picked up a tablet. He turned the screen towards her. On it was a high-resolution photograph of the board, with her small red circle and arrow glowing like a beacon in the chaos. "This," he said, his voice filled with a strange reverence. "This was brilliant. My team of experts, with decades of experience and millions of dollars in resources, has been staring at this problem for a month. And you saw this in under a minute. How?" Alara finally looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. This was not the conversation she had expected. The question hung in the air, a question no one had asked her in a very, very long time. How? How could she explain the way her mind worked? How could she describe the music she saw in the math, the patterns that sang to her from the heart of a problem? I don't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It just looked wrong. The flow was broken. That part," she pointed a trembling finger at the circled equation on the screen, "it was pulling everything into itself. It needed to be connected somewhere else. Somewhere stable." She spoke of the algorithm as if it were a living thing, a circulatory system with a blockage. Her explanation was simple, metaphorical, yet it cut to the core of the issue with more clarity than any of his engineers had managed. Sterling studied her, a sense of profound discovery dawning on him. This was no lucky guess. "You've studied this before?" he asked softly. A shadow passed over Alara's face, the ghost of a life she had tried to bury. "A long time ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was a student. Mathematics. At the university she paused, the memories rising like a flood. My mother got sick. Very sick. I had to leave. To take care of her. To work. The story came out in broken pieces, a confession she hadn't planned to make. The scholarships lost. The dreams deferred. The descent into a world of low-wage jobs where a mind like hers was not an asset, but a burden, a constant, painful reminder of what could have been. She had learned to hide it, to silence the part of her that saw the world in equations and logic, because in her world, it had no value. She had become invisible by necessity. Arthur Sterling listened, his expression shifting from curiosity to a deep, humbling respect. He had built his empire on the idea of finding the best and brightest, paying top dollar for degrees from elite institutions. Yet here, in his own building, sweeping his own floors, was a mind that might be more brilliant than any of them. And his system, the very system he had created, had rendered her completely invisible. He realized with a sickening jolt that his company wasn't just failing because of a flawed algorithm. It was failing because of a flawed culture, a culture of arrogance and blindness that looked at a janitor's uniform and saw nothing else. In that moment, he made a decision. It was risky, unconventional, and would likely be seen as an act of desperation by his board and his staff. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. Come with me, he said to Alara. She looked at him, her fear now mixed with a dawning bewilderment. He led her out of his office and down the corridor to the Helios war room. Inside, the atmosphere was grim. The entire engineering team was gathered, staring blankly at the same complex data streams on a massive digital screen. Marcus Vance was there pacing, his face a thunderous mask of frustration. When Sterling walked in with the janitor in tow, a confused silence fell over the room. Everyone, listen up, Sterling announced, his voice ringing with renewed authority. This is Alara. She will be consulting with us on the Helios problem. A wave of incredulous murmurs rippled through the room. The engineers exchanged baffled looks. Marcus Vance stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. Arthur, what is this? He hissed, keeping his voice low but sharp. This is a circus. You cannot be serious. You are bringing a cleaner, he said the word with undisguised contempt, into a classified strategy session. Our shareholders, our board, they will think you've lost your mind. The grenade of social scorn was now thrown directly at Alara. She shrank back, the eyes of every person in the room on her, sharp with judgment and ridicule. Her gray jumpsuit felt like a prison uniform. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymous safety of the corridors. But then she felt Arthur Sterling's hand on her shoulder, a gesture not of pity, but of solidarity. Her mind, Marcus, Sterling said, his voice cold and clear for all to hear, is not defined by her uniform. She has already given us the key to this problem. Now she is going to help us open the door. He turned to Alara, his eyes locking with hers. He saw the terror there, but beneath it, he saw the flicker of the fire he had been looking for. Don't listen to them, he said softly, for her ears only. Listen to the problem. It's speaking to you. Just tell us what it's saying. That simple act of faith, that quiet word of encouragement, was the gust of wind Alara had been waiting for her entire life. It pushed back the fear, just enough. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped forward towards the massive, intimidating screen. The digital whiteboard glowed, displaying the cascading lines of code and frantic data visualizations that had stumped a room full of geniuses. It was a storm, a maelstrom of information designed to overwhelm. But as Alara looked at it, the noise began to fade. The chaos resolved itself into patterns. The frantic data streams became currents and eddies in a river. She saw the source of the flood, the single point of failure her simple circle had identified. Now she could see the rest of it. She could see how to build the dam. The engineers watched, arms crossed, smirks on their faces. Marcus Vance stood by the door, his expression one of pure, unadulterated cynicism, ready to watch this farce implode. He was already composing his email to the board about Sterling's mental instability. The error, it isn't an error, Alara began, her voice quiet but clear. The room fell silent. It's an echo. The system is trying to correct a data mismatch, but the correction itself is being fed back into the query. It's arguing with itself, Ben, the lead engineer, scoffed. That's a poetic way of putting it, but what does that mean in practice? Alara ignored the condescension. She walked right up to the board and placed her finger on the screen, on the loop she had identified in Sterling's office. This is the mouth. It keeps asking the same question. Then she traced a path through the code, a path no one had thought to follow. And this is the ear. It keeps hearing the echo of its own question and thinks it's a new answer. They are too close. They need to be separated. She didn't use technical jargon. She didn't write a single line of code. She spoke in metaphors of logic, of flow, of harmony and dissonance. She described the system's architecture as if it were a physical space, pointing out where walls needed to be moved and doors needed to be opened. She was not a programmer, she was an architect of pure reason. As she spoke, something shifted in the room. Ben, the skeptical lead engineer, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. He began to see what she was describing, not the code itself, but the flawed philosophy behind it. Her simple, metaphorical language was cutting through the jargon and revealing the elegant, fundamental mistake they had all missed. Reroute the validation protocol, Ben murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Through the secondary caching server, that would create a temporal buffer. It would stop the echo. His fingers flew across a keyboard, translating Alara's architectural vision into concrete code. He brought up a simulation module. The other engineers, their skepticism melting away into fascination, crowded around him. Alara stepped back, her work done. She watched as they implemented her idea, their initial mockery replaced by a frantic, excited energy. Marcus Vance stood frozen by the door, his face a canvas of disbelief. The world as he knew it, a world built on the solid bedrock of credentials and hierarchies, was crumbling before his eyes. Running the simulation now, Ben announced, his voice tight with anticipation. On the main screen, the chaotic, red lines of corrupted data flickered. For a moment, nothing changed. A tense silence held the room. And then, like a sunrise, the lines began to straighten. The angry red shifted to a calm, stable green. The error rate, which had been climbing exponentially, plummeted to 0. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a stunned, disbelieving cheer. They had done it. Helios was stable. No, it was more than stable. Ben's eyes were wide as he looked at the new efficiency metrics. It's 20% faster than before. The bypass she suggested, it's not just a patch, it's an upgrade. Everyone turned to look at Alara. She stood near the wall, looking small and overwhelmed in her gray jumpsuit, as if she wanted to be absorbed back into the shadows. But there were no shadows for her anymore. The room was filled with light, and it was all shining on her. She had not just defused the grenade that threatened to destroy the company. She had caught it in midair, stripped it for parts, and used them to build something better. In that moment, she was no longer invisible. She was the most important person in the room. The celebration that followed was immediate and explosive, but Arthur Sterling's focus was singular. He walked through the crowd of cheering engineers, past a shell-shocked Marcus Vance, and stood before Alara. He didn't offer a handshake or a clumsy pat on the back. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound gratitude and a deep, personal shame for his own prior blindness. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of his entire company. The next day, Sterling called a company-wide assembly. Everyone, from the top executives to the mailroom clerks, was gathered in the main atrium. He stood on a small stage, with Alara standing beside him, not in her gray jumpsuit, but in a simple, professional dress he had his own assistant purchase for her that morning. He told them everything. He told them about the crisis, about the failure of his top minds. And then he told them about the red circle and the arrow, about the janitor who saw what no one else could. He didn't frame it as a fairy tale. He framed it as a failure of their culture. "We have been looking for talent in all the wrong places," he announced, his voice echoing through the silent atrium. "We've been blinded by pedigrees, by titles, by the clothes people wear. We created a system where a mind like Alara's could be right under our noses, and we were too arrogant and too ignorant to see it. That ends today." He looked towards Marcus Vance, who stood in the crowd, his face pale. There was no public firing, no shaming. Sterling's message was not about punishment but about change. "From this day forward," Sterling continued, "we are launching a new internal program. It will be dedicated to finding and nurturing the hidden talents of every single person who works for this company, in any capacity. We will provide education, mentorship, and opportunities for anyone who wants to grow, regardless of their current job title. We will call it the Alara Initiative." A wave of applause, genuine and emotional, swept through the crowd. It was a promise of a new beginning. Finally, he turned to Alara. "And to run this new initiative, to be the heart of our new Department of Strategic Analysis and Human Potential, I can think of no one better." He held out his hand. "Alara, will you accept the position?" Tears streamed down Alara's face, washing away years of quiet hardship and buried dreams. She looked out at the sea of faces, people who had never once looked at her, who were now looking at her with awe and respect. She took his hand, her grip firm. "Yes," she said, her voice full of a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. "I will." Her journey was complete. She had gone from a ghost in the machine to the person redesigning the machine itself, a catalyst for a revolution of seeing, of valuing, of discovering the profound and untapped worth in every human soul. The next time you walk past someone you think is invisible, the person cleaning the floors, serving your coffee, or stocking the shelves, remember Alara. Remember that a title doesn't define a mind, and a uniform doesn't conceal a soul. The world is full of overlooked virtuosos and hidden gems, waiting for just one person to have the vision to look closer. The greatest treasures are not always locked away in vaults, sometimes, they are hidden in the last places we would ever think to look. So I ask you to look closer. See the people around you, truly see them. What hidden genius might you be overlooking in your workplace, in your community, even in your own family? Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their true worth is just waiting to be seen. And in the comments below, tell us about a time you discovered a hidden talent, in yourself or in someone else. Because every single person is a story waiting to be told. All we have to do is be willing to listen.